Thank you, Joe, and thanks for your kind words. My thanks also to the Taoiseach for taking the time out of a hectic schedule to join us here. Of course, before he attained his current elevated status, he had previously spoken at MacGill, and it's of course worth noting that 100% of recent Taoiseach before they became Taoiseach always came to MacGill. Of course, we had Micheál Martin here earlier in the week. Pierce Doherty last night, but so you're all very welcome. Hello also to the people who are watching on our webcast, which is going out live to, no doubt, countless millions all over the world. So I'll crack on because the Taoiseach is under time pressure, as we do appreciate, and we do want to leave a few minutes before he leaves us for questions from the floor. So if you want to put your thinking caps on now, we will come to the floor, if we can at all, for a few questions at the end, and I'll flag those in advance. Taoiseach, I'm going to start with Brexit, of course. What will you say to Boris?
I think I'll start with hello. Maybe congratulations as well. But before I answer that, I just wanted to say what a pleasure it is to be here in Donegal. I've been trying to take the cabinet out of Dublin a bit, and we had a cabinet meeting yesterday in Glenculmkill, and I have to say, when the sky is clear and the weather is good, this county has to be one of the most beautiful places in the world, so it's been a real pleasure to be here. And just want to pay tribute to Joe once again for organising what really is Ireland's premier summer school, so thanks very much for that.
This is shocking home crowd stuff now. Come on, what are you going to say to Boris?
What are you going to say to Boris? Well, obviously the first real thing I suppose I would like to do when I get a chance to speak to him is just get a sense from him as to what he's thinking and what his plans are. He's demonstrated a degree, I think, of flexibility in the past, having voted both for and against the withdrawal agreement. And I don't think he's going to be entirely inflexible in the future, but dealing with counterparts, you really only get a proper sense of where they're going and what their real red lines are, if you like, in the kind of tete-a-tete, the kind of one-to-one meeting that you do either before or after you meet with officials. And really look forward just to, first of all, congratulating him, maybe get a bit of measure of the man, and then really hearing from him as to what his plans are.
Does that mean that you are, to some extent, discounting what we have heard from London in the last 2 days? Because he has completely changed the tone of the way the UK is addressing this question. Do you believe that stuff?
Believe what?
When he says we will leave with or without a deal, that the backstop has to be dumped, not just tweaked, but dumped entirely. That much harder rhetoric that has been the hallmark of his administration 2 days in. Do you take that with a pinch of salt, or do you appreciate, or do you believe that the political context there has changed?
I think he means what he says, and he's certainly taking a much harder line position than Prime Minister May did. But he's also saying that he wants to leave with the deal, and there isn't going to be a deal without a backstop. And you know, as a European Union, we've made that abundantly clear all along, that the backstop is an integral part of the withdrawal agreement. And without the backstop, which gives us the guarantees that we need, not only is there no withdrawal agreement, there's no transition phase or implementation phase for the United Kingdom, and there can be no discussions on a free trade agreement until such a time as we're satisfied that we have the guarantees that we need around Northern Ireland, around citizens' rights and around the financial settlement. So to a certain extent we're kind of back where we started.
Well, he wants to go back to 2017, doesn't he, before the joint declaration, and the EU is unwilling to do so. And if both sides maintain their current position, there will be no deal. Is that a fair assessment of where we are?
Well, I think to a certain extent we are now back to where we were before the political declaration. He does seem to be resigning from those political commitments that the British government gave Ireland and the European Union back in December 2017. And I suppose he's a new Prime Minister and it is a new government, and in a democracy he's probably within his rights to try to reopen those issues, but obviously we're not going to go along with that. But I think it's always important to bear in mind that if the United Kingdom leaves with no deal on the 31st of October, that is their choice. There may be an attempt in the United Kingdom to somehow blame the European Union or somehow blame Irish inflexibility. That is totally wrong. The UK can stop no deal at any time. It can revoke Article 50. It can request an extension for a good reason. It can ratify the withdrawal agreement. So if no deal happens on the 31st of October, whatever the consequences are for the British economy, for the Union and for Ireland, they will be things that they've brought on themselves.
And if he were to turn out to be more reasonable than he sounds in recent days, if he was to, say, seek a tweak to the backstop, a beefed-up review mechanism or something of that order, what would your approach be?
We're not reopening the withdrawal agreement, and everyone across the European Union, the 27 member states, the institutions are all agreed on that. But we have shown reasonableness and flexibility in the past. We were able to give Prime Minister May some additional legal guarantees in Strasbourg during her attempts to get the agreement ratified. They did ask for a review clause and they got one. They asked for the backstop to apply to all of the UK and not just to Northern Ireland, and they got that too. So what we can't do is reopen the withdrawal agreement or renegotiate that. But we have to be open to the possibility of there being changes to the political declaration.
But he says that's not enough.
Let's see what he says in a few weeks' time. You know, this is the way politics is done sometimes, and I don't.
What do you mean by that? Do you mean that kind of public posturing, privately a softer line, that all this is part of an elaborate dance of statesmanship?
If he means what he says by wanting to leave with a deal and wanting to have a free trade agreement with the European Union, well, then he will have to depart from some of what he said in the last couple of days.
What's your assessment of his strength in Parliament? Because I know this idea has been going around government and also in Brussels that, you know, even if he wanted to, Parliament will not let Boris leave without a deal. If you
just look at the arithmetic, it's a pretty weak position, even with the DUP supporting the Conservative Party and with Sinn Féin not turning up. They only have a majority of one. And there are quite a lot of Conservative MPs who are very patriotic people who have already said that they would be willing to vote in such a way that prevents no deal from happening. So the parliamentary arithmetic is difficult for the new Prime Minister. I'm sure he knows that too.
Presumably he too can count.
Yes, indeed. And you know, that is why we can't discount the possibility that there may be an election in the United Kingdom before or after October 31st, and we have to bear that in mind.
Isn't that what his cabinet looks like and his senior staff appointments? It looks like gearing up for an election, which presumably, if he's gearing up for it, he thinks he can win.
Yes, but the timing is everything. You know, he may wish to go to the country having delivered Brexit. You know, so having delivered Brexit with the deal, presumably on the 31st of October, would potentially then be in a strong position to go to the country. That's a very different context and a very different timing to going to the country perhaps in September and saying that Parliament has blocked no deal, or I now have a deal that I can't get through Parliament, and then going to the country then. So we have to be wise to the possibility that we could see the United Kingdom going to the polls, electing a new House of Commons in September, October or November. And all the more reason that we should continue to have the political stability that we have here in Ireland with the coalition of Fine Gael Independence, but also with Fianna Fáil providing that facilitation through the constant supply. And politics doesn't always work, but I think it is a good example of how politics has given Ireland a degree of stability that doesn't exist elsewhere. And it is remarkable if you think about it, when this current government was formed back after the election in 2016, most people, including myself, didn't think it would last very long. And we're now in our third British Prime Minister already.
Do you think
maybe there'll be a fourth yet? Who knows?
Oh, so I was going to anticipate my next question. Will we get to a fourth?
Who knows?
Do you ever worry that by sticking so hard on the backstop that you have in effect brought no deal closer?
I don't think we have, stuck rigidly hard to it. Bear in mind the backstop was something that was co-designed by the UK, Ireland and the European Union. As I mentioned earlier, we never asked that it applied to all the United Kingdom, that it applied to Great Britain. That was something the British government wanted. And when they wanted a review clause, we were willing to put in the review clause. And when they wanted further assurances and political declarations, they got them. So I think we've been very reasonable, actually, all the way along, given that Brexit is certainly not a problem of our creation. It's something that people in Northern Ireland voted against. But a withdrawal agreement without a backstop, like that, is no deal. But it's the same as no deal.
But isn't this the kind of structural flaw at the centre of the backstop strategy, that it, by preventing the ratification of a withdrawal agreement in Westminster, it risks bringing about that thing that it was designed to prevent?
But consider the counterfactual. If we had the withdrawal agreement without the protocol in Ireland and without the backstop, essentially all we'd be doing is buying a bit of time. The withdrawal agreement without the backstop is no deal, just putting it off for a year or two.
Okay, but is the possibility of a hard border in 2, 4, 5 years not better than a hard border now?
I think what we need to do is to secure an agreement that allows us to avoid a hard border. I don't think it's much of an achievement just to try to put it off for another year or two. We've had 3 years of this already, and the uncertainty itself is a problem.
Funny, because with the greatest of respect to your profession, politicians are normally quite content to kick problems down the road. You seem to be running after this one.
Not always. It depends on the circumstances, and it's 3 years or more since the referendum now. And I think the time for kicking the can down the road has long since passed. And it is causing uncertainty. It's causing economic uncertainty, people thinking about making business investments, making lifetime investments. It's caused enormous uncertainty and instability in Northern Ireland. And I don't think we can just kick it down the road for another 2 years in the hope that something crops up.
How do you answer the charge that you've been guilty of utilising the green jersey for political gain, because you have kind of bashed the Brits a bit on Brexit, very possibly with due cause, but you have profited politically by it, haven't you?
All I'm doing is what the head of any government in any country should do, which is to represent their country's national interests. I don't think we've done that in a nationalistic way. I don't think we've done it in a jingoistic way at all. I think we've been quite measured in how that's been approached by me, by the Taoiseach, by Minister McEntee and others.
Our decision, which the government has made with the political support parties across the Dáil, which is essentially to, above all else, maintain our membership of the single market, even at the expense of friction between North and South in trade terms. That seems to me like a very big strategic decision. It's almost like two national questions. Pascal Donoghue has spoken about this in speeches, that there are these two national questions. And we're choosing Europe even at the expense of potential difficulties between us and the North.
Well, I think that's a decision that the Irish people made. We focus a lot on the referendum that happened in the UK. We had referendums too. We decided to join the European Union. We decided to join the single market with the Single European Act referendum back in 1986, I think it was. We decided to join the euro when we voted for the Maastricht Treaty, and decided to do so knowing that the UK wasn't going to join the euro. So we as a nation have decided that our place is at the heart of Europe, that it's our single currency, our customs union, our single market, and we're not going to allow decisions made in the UK to drag us out of that. So we will protect the single market. We'll make sure that Ireland's position within the single market is not diluted in any way. And if that does require friction between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which it would, that there be tariffs, for example, that's a price we don't want to have to pay, but is a price that we would have to pay to protect our jobs, protect our economy, and protect our future.
So can you tell us a bit about those preparations for checks on goods? I mean, I know that the preparations across government are very broad and very detailed, but in a way they all kind of crystallise on this idea of the checks. So, where will the checks be? What will their nature be? What will it mean for people, say, from this county bringing merchandise or animals across the border?
Quite frankly, it's not determined yet. We're still in discussions with the European Commission about no deal planning. Certainly if no deal happens, the UK becomes a third country. That includes Northern Ireland. So, for example, tariffs and taxes will be imposed on imports from Northern Ireland and Britain. Taxes are generally collected online these days, or paid at tax offices. They wouldn't have to be done at the border, but they would have to be paid. And that would certainly be a major restriction on trade. Again, customs declarations would have to be filled in. All those things that people would be familiar with from the past would apply to trade between North and South, and also between Britain and Ireland. And then the kind of checks that we're considering are checks happening at business level at destinations, and also checks at ports of entry. One of the things that we've put forward as part of what could happen in no deal is that the island of Ireland will be treated as a single zone for the purposes of agriculture, for the purposes of what they call SBS, sanitary and phytosanitary checks and so on. And those will be done on the ports of entry, both north and south. But that would require the agreement of the UK to do that, and also the European Union. But I think it's always very important when we talk about no deal planning that we never create the wrong impression that this is a good thing. It's not, and these are not the alternative arrangements that people talk about that don't really exist. This will be very much a damage limitation exercise.
How big will that damage be?
We don't know for sure, but there's lots of reports done that you've seen, ranging from the ESRI to Copenhagen Economics as to what the impact would be. Certainly the economy is slowing down. Probably not a recession, or if there is a recession, only a short one, and a slowdown in employment growth. But we're preparing for that too. And the fact that we have a budget surplus for the first time in a very long time, the fact that we have a strong economy means that we're in a position to counteract some of that. We will be in a position, for example, to borrow, to run a deficit, to put in place what they call the automatic stabilisers, and also invest in business to support businesses, to defend jobs, particularly the agri-food sector, particularly small exporters, and we'll have a very large package available to do that.
What sort of numbers are you talking about when you say very large package? I mean, one person that I was speaking to about this talked about in terms of almost nationalising the entire beef industry. Is that the sort of scale that we'll be seeing possibly in a few months?
I haven't heard that suggestion now. That's a new one. But there are different mechanisms, of course. There's direct exchequer supports, in which case you're talking hundreds of millions, but then there's also loan guarantees. And some of those things are already in place. There's already low-cost loans available to business and industry. And while there's hundreds of millions available to borrow, the exchequer isn't on the hook for that, if that makes any sense. It's partially backed by the government. So there's two sets of ways which we can support and reflate the economy. One is low-cost loans made to business, to the farming sector, which they would have to pay back, obviously, but they'd be low-cost loans. And then there's also direct exchequer intervention, which wouldn't be money that would be repaid.
To what extent do you think that Brexit changes the triangular relationship between Britain, the North, and the Republic?
I think it changes it fundamentally, because we went into the European Union together, Ireland and the UK at the same time, and I think part of the reason why we have a Good Friday Agreement, why we were able to bring about peace in Northern Ireland, was that the European Union and European laws swept away so many differences, not just between North and South, but between Britain and Ireland. And the biggest long-term strategic risk, I think, from Brexit is that convergence that's happened between Britain and Ireland, and also between Northern Ireland and Ireland, will start to change. Not dramatically overnight, but we'll start to see divergence, and that creates, I think, a big strategic risk.
What's the nature of that risk?
Well, I think it raises very serious questions about the future of Northern Ireland.
Do you expect to see United Ireland in your lifetime?
Do I expect?
You're preposterously young, of course, as we all know, but you know.
Not anymore. I'm middle-aged now, but apparently.
He's been fishing for that.
Yeah. But I honestly don't know the answer to that question. But I do think that more and more people, certainly in the event of no deal, more and more people in Northern Ireland will come to question the Union. People who you might describe as moderate nationalists or moderate Catholics, who are more or less happy with the status quo, will look more towards United Ireland. And I think increasingly you see liberal Protestants, liberal unionists starting to ask the question as to where they feel more at home. Is it in a nationalist Britain that's, talking about potentially bringing back the death penalty and things like that, or is it part of a common European home and part of Ireland? And I think one of the things, ironically, that could really undermine the Union, the United Kingdom Union, is a hard Brexit, both for Northern Ireland and for Scotland. And that's a problem that they're going to have to face.
In terms of that discussion, though, I suppose there's two schools of thought. One is that this is a discussion about the future of the islands that we need to have now, and that the government needs to facilitate that discussion. The other, whether by means of a green paper or some version of a New Ireland Forum, but some vehicle or mechanism for that discussion to take place, which I suppose would involve questions like, well, if in the event of unity, would the Irish and British governments just swap Good Friday Agreement places? Would you still have a power-sharing administration in Stormont, just underpinned by Dublin rather than London? The other school of thought is that we shouldn't have that discussion now at this time of unionist anxiety about the union. What do you think?
Yeah, I've heard that argument, and I've had that argument many times, and I tend to come down on the latter side, that having a green paper on Irish unity now, or having a forum on Irish unity now, would be provocative, and we've always been trying to make the point that what we're trying to achieve with our negotiations on Brexit, with the withdrawal agreement, what we're trying to achieve is just the status quo. People being able to continue to live their lives, people continue to be able to trade as they do now. And that's what we're trying to do, is keep the status quo. And there are people who would accuse us of trying to exploit Brexit to bring about a wider constitutional agenda to hasten the United Ireland.
A lot of unionist politicians have made that accusation at you.
They have, some have, and I think we would totally play into that view and that accusation if we were to go down the road now of having a white paper or having an All-Ireland Forum or a Forum on Irish Unity. That obviously could change, in the event of a hard Brexit happening. Those questions then do arise in a way that they don't at the moment.
So, in the event of a hard Brexit, that could be the sort of thing that the government would seek to facilitate, some sort of a vehicle for discussion, at least, about a united Ireland or about the constitutional future.
Well, I think if there is a hard Brexit on the 31st of October, if the United Kingdom takes Northern Ireland out of the European Union against the wishes of the majority of people in Northern Ireland, takes away their European citizenship and undermines the Good Friday Agreement in doing so, those questions will arise whether we like it or not, and we have to be ready for that.
Do you have any expectation of a breakthrough in the North in the foreseeable future?
Not at the moment. There are discussions ongoing. Taoiseach met with the new Secretary of State just today, and I believe it was a good meeting. And those conversations, those talks are underway between the parties in Belfast. But I think in the current context, until Brexit is resolved one way or the other, I think it's going to be very difficult for the parties to come together. It is a real shame, though, that they haven't. It's hard to remember that the Assembly and the Executive were brought down over a controversy about renewable heating, and shouldn't have been. And had they not been, I think it would have been much more likely that we could have had a common position from Northern Ireland, because when the Executive was functioning, politicians, rather than being party politicians, were the Minister for Business or they were the Minister for Education, and they were able to see things in a different way than when they get entrenched in party positions. So it's a real regret to me that the Executive Assembly were brought down and haven't been available to us during this period. And I think as well, if the Assembly was meeting, for example, the Assembly would almost certainly vote by a majority in favour of the withdrawal agreement and the backstop. And having that indication to the world would be a strong statement. And it's actually not understood sometimes when you talk to British audiences and you talk to British politicians that there's more to Northern Ireland than one political party. And it's regrettable that we don't have an Assembly meeting to make those statements and say to the British people that actually this is what Northern Ireland wants.
Would you agree that one of the principal reasons that we don't have a functioning executive is because it doesn't suit the DUP, because of the position of power and influence therein in Westminster? From
my conversations with the DUP, I believe that they do want the Assembly and the Executive to be restored. They do want devolution to be restored. But they are in a particularly privileged position at the moment, and they have a lot of influence, as we all know, in Westminster. They hold the balance of power. The Good Friday Agreement says that the UK government, as the sovereign government, has to be impartial when it comes to Northern Ireland. Allow people to judge for themselves whether they think a constant supply arrangement it shows impartiality. But I think the DUP must also be aware that this arrangement won't last forever, that there is only a majority of one. And if we are looking into a UK election in the next 6 months or a year, the probable outcome of that will be a loss of influence for the DUP. Prime Minister Johnson might win big and not need them anymore, or you may find a coalition government involving Labour, Liberal Democrats and Scottish Nationalists who will have a very different opinion. So I'm sure they can count too, and I'm sure they're smart enough to realise that the kind of influence they have now is probably not going to last very long.
Would that make things easier for you?
I think if Prime Minister May hadn't gone to the country the withdrawal agreement would have been ratified. And I think if her gamble of going to the country had been successful and had she won a big majority, the withdrawal agreement would have been ratified. So it's just the way circumstances happen sometimes, I suppose.
So Prime Ministers need to be careful about plumping for an early election. We might come back to that.
Certainly do. Yeah, certainly do.
I want to move on.
So you should be very careful about opinion polls.
I want to move on from the subject of Brexit and the North. And I put out a call on Twitter earlier on in the week telling people that I was conducting this today and asking them for the sort of questions that they would like me to put to you. And needless to say, I received many helpful suggestions, and some that weren't all that helpful, I have to be honest. But overwhelmingly, a lot of the questions that people had and some of the complaints that people had related to two areas of public services, housing and the health service. So let's talk about housing first. There's 10,000 people in emergency accommodation. There's workers on average wages, principally in Dublin, paying 50-60% of their wages on rent. Would you accept that government housing policy has failed?
No, but I don't think it's succeeded yet. And we have made a lot of progress in a lot of areas. You're right to say there are 10,000 people in emergency accommodation, which is an appalling situation and something that no government can stand over. It has levelled off, though. It had been rising very fast. It's levelled off at around 10,000 for a year now. Is actually, these last month anyway, is starting to fall. That's nothing to be proud of, and I'm not. But I am hopeful, a little bit like the unemployment crisis that we had, or the mortgage arrears crisis that we had, that you do get to a point where it levels off and starts to improve and starts to go down. And I'm hopeful that we're now at that point where we're going to see the numbers of people in emergency accommodation starting to fall month on month now. I'm sure somebody's recording this and we'll pull this out in 6 months' time and tell me whether I'm right or wrong, but I'm a little bit. I dare to be optimistic about this, and part of that is because of government policy, because we are now building lots of houses again. 22,000 new homes built in the last year, and we've added 10,000 units to the social housing stock. Like, this is the biggest social housing programme in decades. It's going to be between 10 and 12,000 a year, 100,000 homes to be added to the social housing stock in 10 years. The last year that Fianna Fáil was in government, for example, in 2010, only 3,000 social houses were added to the housing stock. We're now adding 10,000 a year. It'll go up to 12. And then, of course, more homes are being built for people to buy, and I'm a real believer in home ownership. About 70% of people in Ireland own their own home. I want that to continue to be the case.
But very few
people in their 20s and 30s.
Very few people in their 20s and 30s are buying homes now.
Yeah, and that's what we have to change, and that's what we have to get right. I'm somebody who was able to buy my first apartment, still live in it, and I bought that when I was in my mid-20s, and that wasn't unusual. People in 2003 or 2004 were able to buy homes in their 20s and 30s. That is now very difficult for people. We've a lot of people who are now paying more in rents than they would pay for the mortgage, and there's a real mismatch there. House prices are still 20% lower than they were 12 years ago, and they're levelling off. They're even falling a bit in Dublin, but rents are at record highs, and we have people who are now really stuck in a rent trap where they could well afford a mortgage, but they can't find a property because they're not available, because of lack of supply, and that is being dealt with, or they get caught by the mortgage rules. And I know that's something that the central bank examines all the time. But I do think one aspect of the mortgage rules that is very tough is the fact that you're expected to show that you are saving at the same time that you're renting. But of course, if you didn't have to pay a rent of $2,000 a month, you would be able to save. And, I know the central bank is independent, and I know it's going to look at these things, but as supply increases, I'd hope that they would consider changes in that area so that people can get out of that that rent trap and be able to buy.
So you want changes in the central bank rules. I mean, you've described a malfunctioning market, but your interventions in the market, the interventions of your government in the market, have been very limited, very timid.
We've done some interventions that I think have made a big difference. First of all, procuring and building social housing is a big intervention. We've a €2.6 billion housing budget, the biggest ever, and that's a good intervention. I'd like to see local authorities and housing bodies building more rather than buying them from developers, but it's taking time for them to ramp up that capacity, but it is being ramped up. About 2/3 of the units added to the social housing stock this year will be bills rather than acquisitions or leases. And we've had interventions, for example, like Help to Buy, where people can get some of their taxes back and put that towards a deposit. 10,000 people.
These are all minor tweaks, though, aren't they?
I think if you're one of the 10,000 people who've bought a property with Help to Buy, that's not minor. And then also there's the Rebuilding Ireland home loan, which will continue and is continuing, which is enabling people to get mortgages when they can't get them from the bank. But I think we also need to be very careful about big interventions, particularly in the private housing market, because a lot of them have gone spectacularly wrong in the past. And we want to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And I would rather see us accelerate the supply of housing in a way that's sustainable rather than these kind of boom-bust cycles that we had before. And there was a time in Ireland not that long ago when 70 or 80,000 new homes were being built a year. And I know some people might think, wouldn't it be great if we could do that next year? But I'm not sure it would, because that's where you get back to what we had before. Credit-fueled construction, and pretty shoddy construction as well. And we're really paying the price for that now. So even though it's so frustrating that this problem is taking so long to solve, maybe it's actually better to solve it slowly than a quick fix.
But isn't saying that this is not a problem that can be solved quickly the same thing as saying to people who are in that rent trap, who are paying that huge amount of rent and can't save for a deposit, or people who can't move out of home because they can't afford rents in the private sector? Isn't it the same thing as saying to them, you're just going to have to lump it for a bit? It's going to take a few years to sort this out.
I think unfortunately it's just being honest with people. When it came to social housing, we had to ramp that up from virtually no social housing at all being built in the country to the point where we're adding 10,000 to the stock every year. That had to be ramped up. And when it comes to the supply of private housing, homes for people to buy or homes for people to rent, we had a situation whereby the construction industry was destroyed. The banks were destroyed, so the banks couldn't lend. The construction industry had gone bust. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of skilled workers had left the country. It was never going to be possible to ramp up construction and supply much quicker than it has been. And I think people who pretend otherwise are doing those people a disservice too.
He is a friend and a political ally of yours, but do you think it was a mistake to make somebody who was necessarily inexperienced in dealing with the great machine of government, to make him housing minister?
No, I don't think so. And bear in mind, he was a minister before that. He was a Minister of State at the Department of Finance, so it's not that he came into the housing department without any ministerial experience. If there's a change of government, I imagine most of the cabinet will have no ministerial experience, so obviously that'd be a reason not to have a change of government. But if experience is so important, let's say, for instance, the position housing minister had gone to one of my most experienced ministers, somebody like Richard Bruton. Would that have caused houses to be built any more quickly? Would it have caused more apartments to be built? I don't honestly think so. The constraints that the constraints that have caused it to be so slow would be there no matter who held that position, because we had a financial sector that was destroyed and unable to finance construction anymore, because we had a construction industry that went bust, because we had tens or hundreds of thousands of construction workers who left the country. No matter who was given that position, those natural constraints would have been there anyway. If
you could change one thing about the health system, what would it be?
I'd like it to be less political. I'm sure that sounds terribly self-serving, but healthcare in Ireland is much more politicised than it is in other countries.
Give us an example.
Almost any issue, individual hospital issues, individual cases, become political. And you look across the water in the UK, that isn't the case. And actually, because things go political and because they get escalated to a political level, problems don't get solved at the level they should be solved at. And I think that's one of the biggest problems we've had. We always talk about trying to take politics out of healthcare. The HC was supposed to do that when it was established, you might recall that. It was going to be independent of government and it was going to take the politics out of healthcare. The Sláintecare report, an all-party report, is an attempt to do that as well. But I think a lot of my friends are doctors, as you know, and I'm a doctor myself, and I remember saying to one of my radiologist friends who was heading into work a few weeks ago, I said to him, try to not make any mistakes, because if you do, it'll end up in court and somehow I'll get the blame. That is, it's not the norm in other countries for whoever the Minister for Health is of the day to get the personal blame for everything that goes wrong in the health service, and it allows other people to evade their responsibilities.
But changing that is a matter of political will, is it not? And you talk about political interference. Say the situation in Portlaoise Hospital, where there was a report done, as you know, by various an expert group in the HSE, I think 18 months ago. They recommended that the emergency unit in Portlaoise Hospital was not fit for purpose. It was to have its functions transferred to Dublin, and it sat there because of political influence on it, and it hasn't moved. Well, that's a responsibility of government, though, isn't it, to lead?
I think what happened there was the government disagreed with it, because essentially would have meant downgrading Portlaoise Hospital significantly, and then just hoping that somehow Naas and Tala and Tullamore could pick up the slack. And it wasn't a great plan in that sense.
But that's political interference, isn't it? Here you have a report from clinicians and health experts. It goes to the politicians and they disagree with it. What is that if not putting politics into health?
No, I think there are decisions that politicians need to make, and they are the big policy decisions. But I don't think the operational decisions should be ones that are political. Now, one thing, I'll give you the counter to that now. One of the things we just signed off on was the new Sláintecare areas, the new health regions, if you like, and that was done totally based on population health analysis. It was done totally objectively by Laura McGahey, by Prof Keane and his team, and there was loads of political lobbying to move those boundaries, and we said no. So.
Well, it
does happen both ways.
That's another case in point. So let's examine that a bit, because that is essentially, I'm not sure how familiar people are with it, but it's essentially a return to regional structures such as existed with the old health boards. Now, when the health boards,
not exactly, but
not exactly.
We can go into that another time. Yeah.
Okay, but when the health boards were abolished and the HSE was introduced, nobody lost their jobs. Right? The price demanded for cooperation, as you know, by the unions was that there would be no job losses amongst the people who administrate the service, and a whole new cadre of administrators were brought in and simply layered on top of what was already there. Now, we asked I was at the launch of that particular document, I think it was last week, the week before, we asked if there would be a reduction in the number of administrators and bureaucrats, and nobody could give us an answer. We were told there was no plans for that at present.
Well, like what there won't be is compulsory redundancies, and we have an agreement with the public sector unions that there won't be compulsory redundancies in the public service. But there certainly can be voluntary redundancies as part of the restructuring. And one of the things we said to the Garda Commissioner when he came in, and we said to him, we're delighted you're taking this job. I think he's doing a very good job so far. And we said to him, to do a great job, you're going to have to be able to bring in your own team and a new team, and that we would have a Garda redundancy programme in place to allow him to do that. And we've said the same to Paul Reid, who's the new CEO of the HSE, that the government will approve, in principle, we have to do the detail, voluntary redundancy schemes so that he can reshape the management of the HSE. So I would anticipate there being voluntary redundancies, but not compulsory ones.
The basis of Sláinte Care, one of the basic building blocks for Sláinte Care is over a 10-year period, a total separation of the public and the private sectors. Is that something you agree with? And if so, when did this belief dawn on you?
It is something I agree with, but I also understand the complexities of trying to make it happen. And there's often an overly simplistic understanding of how healthcare works in other countries. People assume that in every other European country it's free and tax-funded and state-provided. That is not the case. Holland is very much an insurance-based model. Everyone has to have health insurance, and hospitals are independent. Very many of them are private enterprises. Some of them are run by religious bodies. It's insurance-based in Germany. In France, you have all sorts of different operators as well. The NHS model, which people are familiar from the UK, is a particular model, but the NHS is private practice too. There is a private clinic in Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, and that is there because there are people in Britain who have health insurance and people who want to pay for second opinions, and private healthcare in the NHS brings revenue into the NHS and subsidises the NHS. So, what we have in Ireland is not as unusual as people may think it is. Our system is very similar to Australia's as well, which is a mix of public and private. And
are you happy for that mix to continue?
I don't like the way it operates at the moment at all. And I often use the analogy of a school. We would never have in our schools private classrooms that were smaller, which private kids attended, and maybe the teacher got more money for teaching in that class.
We absolutely have that in
and
private schools.
Yeah, that's what we have, yes. So for example, if you take the NHS model, where lots of doctors in the NHS do private practice, they do it on their own time. So, for example, you would have a contract, a 4-day contract, we'll say. You get paid for those 4 days, you do your public practice, and then you can do your private practice on the 5th day in your own time. I think that's the kind of model that could work in Ireland. What we have is a very bizarre system where we have public and private patients all mixed in the public hospital, and you've contracts for consultants where they do 25% of their work private, 75% public. It's not the best way to do it. Definitely not. Disentabling it though is complicated. It can be done. We do want to do it.
It's going to cost a pile of money.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that arises is private practice brings income into hospitals. It's not just income for consultants. It's incomes for the public hospital.
700 or 800 million a year.
Yes. So you'd lose 800 million a year to the public system by losing private fees. So that would have to be replaced. And you wouldn't treat a single extra patient, but you'd have to replace that income. And then you'd also have some real difficulties renegotiating the contracts with consultants, and consultants aren't easy to hire. We're having difficulties hiring consultants. There'd be a risk that if you took away their private practice entirely, that they might just go fully private. And one of the good things about the public-private mix in healthcare is that people see the same doctors. The same cancer specialist in Vincent sees public patients and private patients. I wouldn't like to have a situation whereby the better doctors went private only and the lesser.
So this doesn't sound to me like a plan that's going to get off the ground at all.
No, it can be done, but it'll have to be phased and done slowly and done properly and done in a way that doesn't end up being counterproductive.
Okay, let's move on because time is against us. We had Seamus Coffey from the Fiscal Council in here last night. He's my favourite economist, possibly not yours. And he's been quite clear in his criticisms. He says the government is increasing spending at a rate that is not sensible or prudent. What do you say to that?
I disagree. Current spending is increasing at what, about 3.25%?
Current crack at about 4 or 5 this year so far in the first 6 months of the year.
I think that's when you include capital, and I totally stand over the increase in capital investment. This country's infrastructure needs investment, and that's housing, it's new hospitals, it's education, it's roads, it's climate action, it's all those things. But even if it is 4%, I don't actually think that spending increasing by 4% is that huge. We're a country with an expanding population, unlike a lot of other countries. There's like 50 or 60,000 more of us every year, so we have to cater for that. We're an ageing population too, we have to pay for that. And also we're a country that has an economy that is growing fast. So generally the kind of rule of thumb that Pascal and I try to operate is that we should increase spending, but not any faster than the economy is growing.
What will you do if you get a sudden economic downturn?
One thing I would point out as well is that I understand where this comes from, because we had a very bad economic crash 10 years ago in Ireland, and all of us want to avoid a repeat of that. But I think there is a bit of a tendency at the moment for individuals and institutions that missed the last crash to now predict a new one around every corner. An almost overcorrection in that sense. And people talk about echoes of the Celtic Tiger period being seen today, and there may well be some echoes. But bear in mind one thing, and this goes back to your question, we're increasing spending now at half the rate spending was increasing during the Celtic Tiger period. And that period was characterised by a credit bubble, by debt and borrowing increasing by 20% a year. Household debt's actually going down in Ireland.
Well, in fairness though, Seamus Coffey is not like some guy we dragged in from the end of the bar. I mean, well he was last night, but he's the chairman of the Fiscal Advisory Council, which was set up by the government of which you were a part, specifically to warn about political decisions steering the economy into dangerous waters. And he is saying you're increasing spending by too much.
Yeah, I suppose the question would then arise, and it's a fair question. Economists look at things in a certain way. Politicians have to look at other things as well. Where would you propose that we not increase spending? You know, should we spend less on housing, or less on health, or less on education?
Well, that's what you have to decide. Even if you look at the percentage of spending as a portion of GDP, it's low relative to many other countries and GNP. So we're not spending enough? Is that what you're saying?
No, we need to keep a tight rein on spending. And what we set out in the summer economic statement was increasing current spending every year by about 3.25%, and that's the kind of figure that we'll struggle to stick to, but we're going to try to stick to. And above all, the most important thing is that you balance the books, that you bring in more in taxes than you actually spend. And we have a surplus this year. We had a surplus last year. We're going to need to increase the surplus over the next couple of years and use that to pay down the debt. And if you look at the long run average in Irish history, the average in Ireland is to run a deficit of 2%. That's the norm. If you look at the historical average, governments tend to run deficits. We're actually running a surplus, and we need to continue to do that, and we need to continue to pay down our debt, which is very high per capita per head, much higher than it was 15 years ago.
I'm going to ask you two more questions, and then I'm going to go to the audience because, as I say, time is against us. But I want to talk about environmental issues for a sec. Do you believe the more apocalyptic warnings about climate change? I read a report on the BBC yesterday that actually, no, we don't have 12 years to save the planet. We only have 18 months to save the planet. Or do you think it's a manageable problem? Because the actions of your government would tend to suggest the latter, that it's a manageable problem that can be done over a long period of time without basically any pain to anyone.
I believe the science, and I believe what the International Panel on Climate Change says. Yes, there are people who hype it up, just like any issue, but I believe the science. And the science tells us that this is a real serious issue and a real threat to our planet, and that's why we need to act, and that's why we produced the climate action plan that we did, and it's why we're taking the actions that we are. But I do see it as a problem that can be resolved. And I remember when I was a kid growing up, our biggest fears around the environment were around the ozone layer, and they were around acid rain. And they weren't made up, they weren't hyped, they were real problems, but they were also problems that were resolved by changes in environmental policy, by international treaties and action. And just as we saved the ozone layer, just as we reduced the risk of things like acid rain, we can deal with climate action as well.
Because the criticism is made that is made of your government's plan is that it is unambitious. My general rule of thumb to reforms is that if somebody isn't screaming about them, then if nobody is being inconvenienced, then they're not going to do what they're intended to do.
Yeah, my general rule is a different one, and that's if one group are telling you it goes too far and the other group tells you it doesn't go far enough, you've probably got it right. And that's where we were on this one. There were lots of people who were critical of it for it not being ambitious enough. There were also people who are critical of it for going too far, particularly around banning of diesel and petrol cars, taking peat out of the electricity system, taking coal out, all those things that happen in the next 10 years. There was a lot of criticism of that.
Okay, I'm going to come to the audience in a sec, but firstly, just a final general question. I wonder about your core political values. I suppose those of us who've watched your political career for the last 15 years would have said that you started off, I think it's fair to say, as a conservative. There's a story told to me, I think here one year, that you had an engagement with a trade union leader who shall remain nameless, in which he, I think, apologised for some harsh words between you on a radio panel or something, and he said, I have to tell you that, I regard Fine Gael as a very conservative party. And your reply was reported to me as, yes, that's why I joined. But I now see you, I see the Sunday Times derided you as just another social democrat a while back. Have your political values evolved? Have they changed? You had a big change in your own life in the last couple of years. Have your political values changed?
Well, I think I've always been an economic liberal, and I still am. I believe in balancing the books. I believe in supporting business. I believe in enabling people to do well in their lives and making sure that people have more money in their pockets, in doing all of those things that would be characterised as being an economic liberal. I'm probably now a social liberal, and I wasn't in the past. I would have been more socially conservative, and life changes you. And I know some people probably become more conservative as they go older. I became more liberal as I go older, but I think other people have too. And I've always been a passionate pro-European and an internationalist. So I suppose they'd be the values that I would have politically. Do they change over time? Yeah, they do, but I'd be more concerned of somebody whose opinions never changed over time, or who were incapable of having changing their opinions or their values. So, not something I apologise for.
I'm going to go to the audience. We're nearly on time, but Joe is going to moderate this part of this evening's proceedings. I think we have some roving mics. I'm going to shut up and hand over to Joe.